Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we're going to continue our hindsight-fuelled discussion of the Second World War's possible mistakes. Today, it's the Allied policy of unconditional surrender. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. Another week, another podcast. So this time, we're jumping to, perhaps you might say, to the end of the war, so to speak. And we're looking at, as I've already said, the unconditional surrender. One of these probably big debates you find in some and also in historian circles. Was it a clever idea? Was it not a clever idea? Did it drag out and prolong the war? Did it make the Germans fight harder? With the benefit of hindsight, when we then look into the Cold War and all this, was it a clever decision? Was it not? Could and should they perhaps have done something different, demanded something different? That's the topic of today. So another big one as always. I'm sure lots of rabbit holes, lots of tangents. Let's see where it takes us, I would say. Why don't you set us off on the whole thing?
Right, and I'm going to take a page out of your book in a previous episode where we talked about whether appeasement could be considered a mistake or not. I think on the balance, you said kind of no, it wasn't a mistake. And I sort of said, yes, but an understandable one. And one of the principles that you mentioned at the beginning was, of course, Clausewitz. How can you end a war? Well, how can you wage a war? Either you go for total victory or you go for a limited conflict. And that kind of determines then what policies you follow, what kind of peace you might want to make or impose. So that's our kind of ivory tower intellectual background. If we dive right into the middle of World War II and we think, well, where does this idea come from that the Allies want an unconditional surrender from Germany, not a compromise peace, not evacuate all the territories, not go back to your 1918 or 1919 borders, none of that. They say that doesn't matter. You could offer us 1919 borders, leave Poland, leave everybody, and they wouldn't accept it, right? It's unconditional. That's what we're working with here. This comes a little bit in an unplanned way, which is, I think, pretty interesting. So you have this series of conferences in the war, right? Those of us who are into World War II, which is probably many of you out there, listeners.
I hope so.
Indeed. Or else you're at the wrong place and this is going to be a long 40 minutes. But, you have these conferences where the Allies are trying to figure out their policies and how they're going to wage the war. And as the war goes on, they start to think more about, well, what might the end of the war look like? We know the ones at Potsdam, Yalta, Tehran, and there's also Casablanca, which is an important one in January 1943. And this is when Roosevelt, in a speech, basically says, we're going for unconditional surrender. What's interesting about this is that wasn't really planned and agreed upon with the Soviets or the Brits. Now, Stalin is not at Casablanca at all. Churchill didn't know that Roosevelt was going to come out and introduce this concept to the public of unconditional surrender. So it's kind of got a bit of a weird start to it as an official Allied policy, let's say, in a way. I think it was understood that they would probably go for that kind of objective in the war anyway, but putting it out there in public brings up this question of whether it was a mistake or not a bit more, because then the Germans know and they can react to it and they can use it for propaganda purposes or what have you, which we will get into. But I think the situation in January 1943, why would Roosevelt have come up with this for his speech, is important. You had these debates going on between the big three about what are we going to do next in the war? And of course, the Soviet position is you guys are not fighting enough, right? You got kicked out of France in 1940. Yeah, you're doing some stuff in North Africa, but it's not much compared to what's happening on the Eastern Front in terms of German divisions tied down and so on, that kind of thing. So they're pushing for this famous Second Front. And the Americans are quite receptive to this. Roosevelt has a kind of a good opinion in a way of Stalin, much better than Churchill had of Stalin. Probably turns out Churchill was right about that. But so Roosevelt is also, and some other Americans are kind of also pushing the Brits. Like, we need to do more. Could we D-Day into France in 1943 already? I mean, this was kind of, they even worked up some theoretical plans. I think it was Operation Bolero, I think, was the theoretical plan for a D-Day in 1943 into France. And the Brits are against this. They say it's too early. It could be a disaster. We can't risk it. We should nibble away where we can with the air war, with Sicily, Italy, and all that. And they win the day, essentially. They win that argument, the Brits do. But the Americans are not super happy about it. And one of the interpretations of why unconditional surrender becomes the public policy is that Roosevelt's basically trying to say, we're all in public. Even though I just compromised with the Brits and said, okay, fine, we'll wait till 1944 until we invade France, I want to show the Soviets and I want to reassure the Americans who are now frustrated, those of the Americans who are frustrated by the delay, that we're all in. And so it's not like the purpose, the end result was a complete surprise. But phrasing it that way and setting it out as this is our policy was kind of a bit of an improvisation. And so it's unconditional surrender has a bit of a weird beginning, let's say.
No, it has, absolutely. And it's interesting that it is the American president who comes up with the idea, because there is, of course, a historical link to this whole question and debate of unconditional surrender. And that is, of course, the US Civil War, where Ulysses S. Grant had demanded the unconditional surrender from the Confederates. So there's a bit of for a better phrase, an American history link to this whole thing. When you look at the date, so we are now in January 1943. Stalin, for example, he's not at this particular conference because this is the final stage of the Battle of Stalingrad. So this matters. And again, exactly as you say, so here's the a big war being fought in the East. The Battle for Stalingrad is coming to an end. Stalin constantly reminding the Allies that they're not doing enough, demanding the Second Front. The Allies, of course, would say at this stage, that's the air war, we already have one. And then say, okay, you know what? It's unconditional surrender. That's a good thing. So that sends out a message of unity, you might say, to the world. It is really interesting when you look at the British-American relations within this. There is still some debate over this amongst historians. How much did Churchill, how much did the British know about this? So there's the one camp that says, I know, Churchill had been informed about this, he bought into it, and he said, you know what, that's a great idea. Probably, from a British point of view, you might say it is a great idea, because as you say, it's all in, isn't it? It's not only all in on the Eastern Front, but of course, Britain at this stage is already the junior partner, and Britain knows that it is the junior partner. So the last thing you want is the Americans saying halfway through, oh, that's fine, well, leave it at that. I don't know, we've kicked the Germans out of France, that's fine. So let's make peace. So that's the one camp. The other camp says, and there are some newspaper articles on this as well, and a correspondent at that time wrote about that, and he said that the Church was utterly surprised and had no idea. So we're not entirely sure, but probably you might say, I would argue for British foreign policy at that particular time, it worked quite well because it did show the Allies, that's of course the important bit, but also the world that the Allies would stand together. And I think that's the important message that you get here. But yeah, it's an interesting one. 1943, it's also early days, isn't it? I mean, the big question is always turning points in wars. Do you have them? In retrospect, we always create them. We say, what's the turning point? The battle for Moscow? Was it Stalingrad? Was it Kursk? Was it Midway? Whatever. When you're in the situation, of course, it's all a bit different. 1943, yeah, the tide's turning, but it's not that obvious yet that the Allies are really going to win. I mean, in the long run, probably, but who knows what's going to happen in between. So it's quite, is it bold? Is it right to call it bold? I'm not quite sure. Determined, most definitely. And of course, it has all sorts of knock-on effects and ripple effects that you might argue we still see and feel today. So very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think part of the crux of this question of if we're going to debate, was the unconditional surrender policy a mistake or not? I think there are maybe two main elements to that. One is, was there a viable alternative policy that they could have pursued that would have been better or made more sense or come to a better outcome? And the other one is, did it extend the war? Did it prolong the war by giving the Germans more reason to fight? Or did it shorten the war by keeping the Grand Alliance together more effectively and giving them a policy tool that they could agree on when they otherwise hated each other? So I want to try to break those down with your help. I do think there's something to be said for this idea that the unconditional surrender idea, it does give you a goal. It gives you a simple, morally justifiable idea. And coalition warfare is hard. And coalition warfare with essentially a kind of enemy between the Brits and Americans on the one side and the Soviets on the other, ideologically, they're quite opposed to each other. There was the military intervention by the Allied powers in the Russian Civil War against the communists in 1918, 19, and 1920. Actually, I guess even until 1921. And the Brits and Americans were involved in that, and the communists never forgot it. In fact, Russian nationalists today also never forgot it, even though that's a little more complicated since the intervention was on behalf of other Russian nationalists. But I digress into another rabbit hole-y tangent. The point is, one could say, in defense of unconditional surrender, it gives you a simple goal that you can all agree on. You don't have to fall out over certain policy, this or that, or this condition of surrender or that condition of surrender with this ally or allies from the Soviet point of view who you don't like, and you have different ideas about how the war should go and what should happen after the war. You can put that all to the side by saying, yep, we all agree on unconditional surrender. And so it allows you to move on and wage your coalition war without getting caught up in all of your disagreements and ideological hatreds and all that sort of thing. So it does give you that tool as a plus, I guess, as a non-mistake argument. I don't know how you see that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And in the previous episode, we talked about the pitfalls and the issues that come with coalition warfare. And you're absolutely right. It is, in inverted commas, a relatively straightforward aim and goal, isn't it? Unconditional surrender. That's easy, so to speak, in inverted commas. So it makes perfect sense, particularly when you have these tensions inside the coalition. We mustn't forget this. We always think, well, here's the grade 3 and they get on nicely and fine. No, they don't. I mean, the one thing I'm still always surprised about is when you go back, for example, going to 1939, and you look at the invasion of Poland, which of course leads to the declaration of war by Britain and France. Well, realistically, Britain and France should have declared war on the Soviet Union as well, because the Soviet Union invades Poland. I mean, just a short while ago, I was standing on the demarcation line on the River Bug between the Germans and the Soviets in modern-day Poland. You think, this is all a bit strange. For other reasons that we're not going to explain here now in this particular podcast, of course, they decided not to, because fighting two of the big military powers in Europe would have been a bit too much, I guess. But that's a different matter. But you see these internal tensions that are coming out, and so that's quite easy. Again, in this situation, you know that the Soviet Union is doing most of the actual fighting. About 80% of all casualties in World War II are sustained on the Eastern Front. So you need to give something to the Soviets if you want to keep them in the fight as well. Because the Soviets, the Western Allies knew that Stalin had put out peace feelers all the way up to early 1943. And even Hitler talks about this in his famous or infamous table talks. And it's like, wow, we had another offer from the Soviets. I basically just pushed them back, repulsed all this. And he says, well, even if I signed a treaty, I'd start again next month because that's what I want to do. That's my aim, to crush communism. But so even the Western allies are not 100% convinced about what goes on in the Soviet Union. They know that Stalin is a very shrewd politician. He did have an alliance with Hitler all the way up to 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. So maybe it's also just a trust issue here. So it fixes and binds people together, doesn't it? That's one aspect. And of course, another aspect is looking at the situation again within the context, the historical context. So you're now in 1943, and you look at this as well. You're fighting basically round two. World War I was round one, and now you have round two. In 1918, you might say they stopped halfway through. So the Germans are still standing in some parts of France, mainly Belgium. They've occupied vast territories in the East. In the East, they were victorious, and then they collapse and surrender. Different story, different podcast, dear listeners, but that's what happens. Then, of course, is one of the reasons why in Germany you then have this whole idea of the step in the back myth. So the army was victorious, and it was only the Jews and the socialists and the Democrats and the communists who stepped the people and the army in the back, and that's why Germany lost the war, which was a very, very strong narrative in the German-speaking world at that particular time. And you might argue one of them, why Hitler came to power in the first place. And most people, not all of them, but most people in Germany would subscribe to this to one degree or another. So why would you do the same thing now and stop, for example, in mid-1943? Even if the Germans decide, you know what, we've had enough, we're going to surrender. They're still in France, they're still in the Soviet Union. You probably know that 15 years down the line, they do exactly the same thing again. So this time around, really hammer it home to the Germans that you've lost the war and you will never do anything like this again. And again, when you look at the history of post-World War Europe, at least in the German case, that's worked extremely well. Some people might argue that the Germans learned their lessons too well. So when it's all about militarism, build up a strong military, all these things, debate that we're having at the moment again. And of course, we've got a very strong anti-war, anti-military movement in the German-speaking world, not least for these reasons. So you can see lots of different angles again coming in. And that, of course, also raises then the question you already mentioned: well, could they have made peace in the first place? Was that a viable option? And again, of course, in order to do this, you need to look at what goes on in Germany. So, 1943, 1944, would the Germans have made peace? What do you think?
Personally, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's useful to look at how did the German government, the Nazi government, and the German public talk about and think about the war separate from the idea of unconditional surrender. And even before the idea of unconditional surrender was public Allied policy. And there's not a lot of wiggle room for compromise there. I think my impression is that how the war was conceived ideologically by the Nazi government doesn't leave room for compromise pieces. Maybe for some of them in the last 6 months or 8 months, there might have been certain compromise, but even then they're not in charge. Hitler's still running the show, and he and his close associates are not interested in compromise, potentially until the bitter end. I also think that, my impression from what I've read, I know there's some different literature and different shades of gray around it. I have the impression that most Germans really conceived of the war as national survival, even if they didn't go all in for all of the ideological nooks and crannies of Mein Kampf and Jews this and Jews that. Of course, there's a general degree of anti-Semitism, but I don't think every German would have signed off on, yes, gas chambers this and so on and all of that. But if your government is this ideologically committed and your population still considers this to be a struggle for national survival, how do you get around that? How do you say, well, actually, yeah, we're just kidding. We're going to give up our conquests and go back to our 1919 borders? It's not conceivable. It's not in the realm of what they are thinking about. Goering gives a big speech in October 1942, I think it is. Yeah, here are my notes, October 1942. This is before the idea of unconditional surrender is publicly the Allied policy. And this speech is completely apocalyptic, that the international Jews control the Soviets and the capitalistic Anglo-Americans, and they're going to wipe out the German people if we lose the war, all this kinds of stuff. They find sort of obscure little texts by some American who talked about sterilizing Germans or something, and they blew this up into, you see, this is what the American government really wants, which is, of course, absolutely not the case at all. It was some eccentric weirdo writing some little article. That's just one example. This is how they're framing and understanding the war before unconditional surrender even becomes a thing publicly, officially. So I tend to think that other options are not that realistic. Yes, there was the July 20th plot, but at the same time, it comes so late. Also, it failed for a reason, right? There's not enough support. There's like big wigs in the Nazi party and in the army are not into it. You do have some important generals, but not the important generals. And so, I don't know. I could be convinced otherwise, but from what I've read, I just don't see it.
Well, I think the main problem that you find in the German campus, and you mentioned it, is the leadership. Hitler is in charge. He's not going to make peace. And even if you get rid of Hitler, say Goering steps up, is he going to make peace? You don't know. You don't know this. So we've got absolutely no idea. But as long as Hitler is in charge, you're not going to get a peace, because that's just the ideology. It's the survival of the fittest. All these things that play part of his particular ideology. So he's not going to make peace. Well, that's pretty obvious. Of course, he had kind of tried to make some sort of peace in the early stages when he made this interesting peace offer to Britain in 1940. But the moment the war goes into the East, everything changes, because that's the war he really wants. And he mentioned the 20th of July plot. I mean, as you know, we did a number of podcasts on that as well. I mean, the reason why these guys wait so long is because they want to be absolutely clear and show to not the world, but the German people that Germany can't win anymore. So you've got D-Day, you've got Operation Bagration, the big operation in the East. We talked about this in a podcast as well. And that should open the eyes to everybody. The war's being lost. You can't win this thing anymore. It's over. So why not make peace? But yeah, as you say, as long as Hitler is there, that's not going to happen. And there are a number of interesting quotes from people, for example, with Hitler in the bunker. So we're now in 1945. So everything's falling apart in April 1945. And you've got, for example, Burgdorf and Krebs and other people, all these famous generals sitting there. And some people say, well, let's finish this. This is silly. We're fighting in the rubble in the streets of Berlin. Why are we doing this? And then some of them say, well, you know what? Germans saying, we stopped 5 minutes before 12. That's what you say in German. So they're very close to the end, to the finish. We did it once in 1918. I'm never doing this again. So this time we fight to the end and to the finish. And Hitler even says the same thing. And he says, I've only ever finished 5 minutes past 12. So it doesn't really make sense in English. In German it works. So you go the extra mile, so to speak. And he at least always hoped all the way to the end that there would be some sort of miracle, of course. Well, that's the big thing that would save him, just like, and here we go, it had saved Frederick the Great in the 18th century, where Prussia was falling apart. It was all over, and suddenly something happens, and boom, Prussia survives. So there are these accounts where he sits in the bunker staring at this painting of Frederick the Great. So probably sheer desperation. But if he's still there, or as long as he's there, there's absolutely no hope that the system would, you might even say, collapse or whatever, which it then does, of course, relatively quickly. And what you also find is, of course, this whole question of mobilizing. How mobilizing is this to the German population? So you hear someone giving a speech declaring, we want unconditional surrender. As you say, well, you're already fighting a war for national survival, aren't you? So do you think it changes anything? What's your view?
Again, I could potentially, I'm not saying I have an ironclad, complete mastery of every piece of literature on the topic, but my impression is not really. Perhaps in the last months of the war, when Germans hometowns are being flattened like never before, then maybe. But of course, they're still in the grip of the Nazi government at that time. But I read of a November 1944 Allied intelligence report that I thought was kind of revealing, where they interviewed quite a few German prisoners. And even in November 1944, and the purpose of this survey was, why are they still fighting? Because the Western Allies in particular were surprised. We kind of thought, okay, we whipped them in Normandy. We're all the way up to the German border now. The Soviets are advancing. There's clearly no hope for them. Why are the soldiers not surrendering en masse as they started to do in the summer, late summer and fall of 1918? Basically, German soldiers were more reasonable in 1918. They knew the jig was up before their government accepted it. In 1944-45, they're not doing that much. And why? And the conclusion of this intelligence report was essentially most still believed that their cause was about national survival, that if they lost, they'd be completely wiped out as they conceived of the German nation, and that therefore their cause was just. And this article I read, or this chapter in a book that I read, also said that this belief was generally true of the German population earlier in the war as well. 1941, 1939. It's not like the German population was chomping at the bit for war in 1939, but they accepted how this war was characterized as national survival of different races going to wipe each other out. And so if you have a government like the one that you've described, with Hitler at the head and having this ideological conviction to continue the war come what may, and then you have a population that they're not all tiny Hitlers, obviously. A few books that argue that, but I'm not sold. What was it? Goldhagen, I think, was it?
Goldhagen, yeah.
Anyway.
The willing executioners.
But that's the one. But if they think that they're going to be wiped out, then, or some degree of that, then what the Allies say or do doesn't matter to them. And they're so subject to propaganda as well. I'm not trying to get collective responsibility off the hook, but to give you one other example, listeners, about this sort of twisted view that was prevalent for many in Germany. Many people believed this rumor that German Americans were being forced to wear a swastika on their clothing and being discriminated against in a similar way to how Jews in Europe were being made by the Germans to wear a yellow star. So to them, this is all part of the normal total war of national survival. So they're kind of operating, and this is why I give this example, they're operating in a separate, alternate reality in many ways. Not exclusively. There are many, I've read many accounts, they're getting bombed, they're in the cellars, and they say, this is crazy, Hitler's gone crazy, we're obviously going to lose the war, we should stop it. But you do also have this element of we're existing in another reality, and what the Allies actually say about what they want for the future has no impact. And to me, that's kind of where I'm at, more or less, on this question.
The whole point of propaganda is absolutely right. It's very difficult to understand today, but if you grow up in that system, particularly if you're a younger person, and all you've ever really known as an adolescent and young person is the Nazi system, you don't have a free press, for example. You do know the history, so to speak, or you think you know the history of the First War, the step in the back. So that's the frame of reference. You then have, there are tensions in the interwar period between Germans and Poles. This just exists, the Germans killing Poles, Poles killing Germans. That happens in these areas. And then, of course, you're told in 1939 that the Poles have suddenly attacked German territory, the famous radio station at Gleiwitz, which, of course, was orchestrated and prepared by the Nazi regime. But that's what you're told. So you come back, so we are now attacking Poland to defend ourselves. Next step is, because you're fighting a war there, the evil Western powers, just like as they had done, they didn't, but in this frame of reference, in the First World War, are now attacking Germany, because it's Britain and France that declare war on Germany. Germany didn't declare war on them. Hitler gives the speech in 1914, which he offers peace to Britain. Britain declines, doesn't want it. I think the big really shift, when you look at the SD reports, the secret state police, the first time where people start, hang on, this is all a bit weird, what are we doing here? Is when they actually go into the East in 1941. Because they know, well, Germany's got an alliance with the Soviet Union, so why are we doing this? Then, of course, they're told because the Soviets were preparing for a big offensive, so it's a preemptive strike, and so on and so forth. You then declare war on the US. Well, that's a bit weird as well, isn't it? Isn't that a bit too much? Yes, but obviously, because as you said, well, the Jew of the Wall Street is the same as the Jew of communism. So it's the world Jewry. Doesn't it make sense? You need to fight, but yeah, actually, well, if you believe this, if that's your worldview and all that, well, then suddenly that makes sense. And then you're back to this against the world of enemies. You're fighting against the world of enemies, which is a very German phrase and slogan anyway. It goes back to First War, goes back all the way to the Middle Ages, goes all the way back to even, I don't know, the Nibelungs and all that, the famous German poem from the Middle Ages. So it's a very German thing, standing alone against the world of enemies. And even if you go down, as long as you go down, well, I want to say in style, but that's the wrong word. But as you know, well, heroically and fighting, that is good enough. It's a bit like Ragnarok, isn't it? Where the heroes die and then the world comes to an end. So it's a very Germanic thing as well, you might say. If you want to play this card, did that really affect the normal German? Probably not. I think it's more about this war of survival, defensive war that's been imposed once again onto this country that only wants peaceful life in the center of Europe, and everyone around us is evil. So we have to fight this defensive war. And I think that's probably, I'm with you on that one, where most of the people stood. I think the vast majority, which also you might say is perhaps a reason why the closer you then get to Germany, why these guys keep fighting. And why they're even fighting harder, at least up to probably, well, early 1945. Everything then falls apart, at least in the West, from February, particularly March onwards. But up to that stage, when you get the battle for Hürtgen Forest, for example, Eastern Front is very different anyway, because it's against the Soviet hordes and all that. But even in the West, as you explained, so why they keep fighting? Well, the war has changed now, it changes war's character. You are now defending your home soil. And that is something really powerful. It's not, in most cases, I would argue, it's not about the Nazis and fighting for the regime. It's defending your home soil. We talked about it in different podcasts. Of course, you also have these people going around and shooting and hanging their own soldiers. So there's fear as a factor as well. You do get that. But I think for the average person, it's survival of the nation, of the people, and that's important. The big change, you might say, in the German case, if you want to continue with that a little bit, probably comes in, if there is a big change, or at least that they were made aware of all of this, comes in, I think it's is it the 18th of February, if I'm not mistaken, 1943. That's Goebbels' famous Sportpalast speech.
The Total War speech.
Probably, yeah, the Total War speech. So probably the most famous speech he ever gave. And of course, that's get quoted up and down the yin-yang all the time, because the idea is it sends out the signal and the message of that regime and what you do. I think anything we need to say on that speech in itself? What do you think? Should we elaborate that point a little, or?
Well, I mean, if you'd like to go ahead, I feel like the speech is it's a sign of the fear of the regime that after Stalingrad, basically, that they're going to be in it now for the long haul. Any idea of a quick defeat of the Soviet Union is already out the door, but even a midterm defeat of the Soviet Union now looks like very, very complicated. I think it ties into the idea that if we were to think of unconditional surrender as a mistake, you'd have to then think, well, there's another option. If you think there's another option, which I suppose we mostly agree there probably wasn't, but even if you could create in an alternate history, well, maybe it would be this, and Germany would keep this and do this, and some military guy would become the head of the government. I don't know. Let's say you think up an imaginary scenario where there was another option. You need a good faith actor, for one thing, on the other side. For any international treaty, even if it's with an enemy, you have to accept that the person is somehow you have to assume that they're a good faith actor, even if you don't like them. And you gave a great example where Hitler basically said, in response to Stalin's sort of peace feelers, well, yeah, but I'd start it up again in a month anyway. So there's no possibility of a good faith actor as long as the Nazi regime is still in power, which means there's probably not very much of a viable option. Now, there were some opponents of the idea. I think 2 American ministers, right? The Secretary for War, Stimson, the Secretary of State, Hull, they kind of were like, we're a bit worried because at a later stage, they were a bit worried that the Germans might be motivated because at a later stage in 1944, there's this famous/infamous Morgenthau plan that becomes public, and that the Allies toy with, should we adopt this? Should we implement this after the war? Should we not? Basically, Morgenthau's an American, Jewish American, which the Germans make a big deal about then. And he has this plan for deindustrializing Germany. And it gets some serious consideration, right? So these American ministers are like, maybe that's going too far with the unconditional surrender, that we're going to, make Germany into a bunch of agricultural land and not be industrialized and all of that. It doesn't get implemented in the end, but the Germans do use it for propaganda purposes. But as I say, I guess I've come to the tentative conclusion so far that they could have danced around on their hats and said they were going to give every German a castle, or they could have said, we're going to turn every German into an indentured servant, and it wouldn't have made that much of a difference.
Yes, I think that's very true. And yet you might perhaps say, at least from the Nazi regime perspective, the Morgenthau, however you want to pronounce it, Morgenthau, German, of course, dear listeners, if you don't know it, translates as morning dew. There we are, that's what it means. Another little tangent there. So you've got this, you've got the demand for unconditional surrender. At least the regime, they thought that would be a great rallying point, you might say, for the German people. And Goebbels, to come back to that speech very briefly, for example, he talks about this, and we've all seen it where he screams and shouts, I ask you, do you want total war? Do you want it, if necessary, more total than you can even, and more radical than anything that we can yet today even conceive? So everyone, of course, claps because it was a very well-chosen audience. But what I found even more interesting was 2 things. The first one is when he finishes the speech with a very famous quote, "Now people rise up and storm break loose," which probably doesn't mean anything to most of the listeners. To the Germans, that case, that was a very, very strong phrase, you might say, because it goes back to a chap called Theodor Körner, who had fought in the wars of national liberation in 1813-15 against Napoleon. So Germany's been more or less defeated, but then just like a phoenix from the ashes, Germany rises up again and is victorious. So this was a strong symbol to these guys in those days.
In a
coalition. But that didn't matter to them. It's the same.
Yeah.
If we continue with that little tangent, I mean, you've got this famous film Kolberg.
Yeah.
So really interesting, made in late 1944, early 1945. Kolberg is one of the few fortresses that holds out against Napoleon at that particular time, 1806. Prussia collapses, blah, blah, blah. So when they made this film, it was a propaganda film. They actually moved an entire division from the Eastern Front to use the soldiers as extras. So you can see how important, well, Goebbels particularly, because he was the propaganda minister, saw all this. So he thought it was very important. He's supposed to have said, well, the unconditional surrender and the Morgenthau plan, that is worth, I think he said, is it 20 or 40 divisions? Because it will really get people going. And of course, where you get, from his point of view, the other thing is that you can now finally mobilize society. Because up to this stage, up to the speech, really, you might say, this is why the speech is actually quite important, regardless of all the screaming and the shouting and all this. Up to this stage, the Nazis had a policy of bread and cannons, because they were always worried that if they go too hard and harsh on the population, put too many hardships on them, you might have a revolution like in 1918. So it very, very much, in inverted commas, life in Germany up to that stage was not, very inverted commas, that bad. It wasn't a life of total war. That really changes from 1943 onwards. Of course, got the bombing campaigns really kicking off, but also the way they were made to work towards the war effort. And for example, I've got a quote here from this famous speech. He said, "Do you believe with the Führer and us in the final total victory of the German people? Are you and the German people willing to work if the Führer orders 10, 12, and if necessary 14 hours a day, and to give everything for victory? Do you want total war? If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything that we can even imagine today?" So that's the famous end of it. But the first bit is quite interesting. So really putting the country on a war footing. As a consequence of that, they now started closing restaurants, they started closing theaters, cinemas remained open. But you can see they used this to radicalize, you might perhaps say, society and how you use society for the war effort. So there is a bit of an impact. Did it really convince the population that, there is this plan, doesn't really change anything really? I'm not quite sure, because you either do your bit or you don't. But for the regime, that was quite important. So from a pure regime's point, you might say it was a godsend, because they thought we can now really go for it and make the war more radical and either win or, in this very good Germanic sense, take the world down with us. That was very heroic. Not heroic, but very Germanic, wasn't it?
Yeah, yes. Very dramatic, like all those
exactly.
Romantic era authors in the early 19th century, recycling the Germanic legends of Roman and pre-Roman times. I think the Goebbels speech, I don't know, my feeling is that he made that speech more as a result of military developments on the Eastern Front than of any Allied sort of policy for post-war world or post-war Germany or what have you. That's my gut feeling. And from what I've read, that's what stuck with me more, I would say, is that even if the Allies had said something else and the Germans still lose the Battle of Stalingrad, that panic, that urge to total war and destruction would still be there.
I think you're right, and also we use the speech now all the time because it's seen as this symbol of Nazism and the evil regime. You've got this guy standing there screaming, shouting, it's all about total war. Everyone claps. That it sends out a very strong image. I think if you go back and look at the perception of the people in 1943, it probably wasn't that strong. They had other things to worry about. I mean, how many speeches in Parliament do we watch today, even the famous ones, and how do we discuss them, how they're perceived? Maybe it was a bit more in those days because you were kind of encouraged to listen to it and what have you. But we do know from research, for again, Ian Kershaw's written about this quite a bit, how speeches were perceived and what part of a speech people remembered and talked about. Because quite often, again, you can see the next day after the speech was made, the SD, so the secret state police, wrote their secret reports. Once a week, a report was sent up the chain of command. And so they talk about, or they report on what the people were talking about in relation to these speeches. And quite often they could see, well, this speech completely missed the point because Hitler, Goebbels might have been talking about, I don't know, total war and this and that and the other. But sometimes to the audience, something else was far more important. So there's one famous speech where Hitler talks about the war in the East, and people say, hang on, it's all very strange here because the casualty figures he's given us are far too low. So what's going on here? So actually it backfired. That's what the SD report says. So I think we have to be slightly careful not to put too much emphasis. But where it is interesting, I find, is because you can see this shift here. And I think it's all part of this package of early 1943. And I think you're absolutely right in this. So it's the military development you have anyway, and particularly on the Eastern Front at this stage. North Africa, Tunisgrad comes a little bit later. But Stalingrad is a big one. That's even in the German mind. Oh, this doesn't feel good. There's something going wrong on the Eastern Front. They try to keep quiet about this for quite some time, and then, of course, in the end, they try to use it for propaganda purposes. And on top of that, you might say, as the last brick, so to speak, you then put this whole thing about unconditional surrender. I think if I'd listened to that speech in 1943, I'd be more worried about, hang on, what's going on in the East right now? Because if you're still winning, I mean, you don't really care what the others are saying. So you're either winning or, okay, if you lose anyway. And particularly because you have all this ideological input, and you say, well, the Soviet communist hordes are coming from the East, German culture against the barbaric hordes, all that kind of stuff. Doesn't really matter because you think it's Fides Germaniae, so the end of Germany anyway, if they win. So I think we have to be slightly careful here that we don't put too much on it. which of course is one of these problems, generally speaking, I find when we look at history in general, isn't it? This is a prime example, because history is extremely complex, and sometimes you just need this little picture or whatever it might be to focus people's minds. But the moment you start looking at a bit more detail, it gets a bit more difficult.
Yeah, it's the age-old question. We have the speech. We can look at it and try to draw conclusions and make historical arguments, but we don't have a printout of the thoughts of everybody who read that speech in the newspaper the next day. So, the source we have is what we look to, but in fact, it has limitations or it doesn't show everything. And that's
Absolutely.
part of the historian's game.
And even the audience, because you always, when you dear listeners, you probably have seen the speech and listened to the speech, and you see Goebbels speaking, and then they zoom in onto some of these people in the audience.
Oh, they're
and
like
of course they're all cheering. They're handpicked. Also, a lot of wounded people, what have you. But of course they're handpicked. So you get the Nazi. And also, let's face it. So you're in a state like this, even if you're not 100% convinced about what he's saying. Let's be realistic. Suddenly you've got a TV camera but pointing at you. You're probably going to cheer just because, if you don't, well, your face is going to be all over the news the next day, and that's not good for you or your family. So it's just stuff like that on top of it. But of course, they were handpicked as well. So you get the diehard Nazis in there, absolutely. So, so right. It's an interesting one. Mm-hmm.
Right. Now we've been on a very substantial but related tangent about the speech and it as a historical source and the crowd and all the rest of it. I want to bring it back to our central question for the episode so we can wrap things up for our listeners about unconditional surrender. I do think there are two small elements I've also come across that I wanted to mention very briefly here. One is, was it morally necessary to do that? Now, I know that morals in politics and morals in war are very, very gray, let's put it that way, because both sides of a war usually claim that it's just, usually claim they're more moral than the opponents. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not true, sometimes it's in between. But if there's this idea on the Allied side that we have this moral crusade, let's say, we need to bring justice to any people who would do the kinds of things that the Nazi regime has done and is doing, then how do you justify it if you say, oh, actually, we're not going for unconditional surrender, we're going for a compromise peace. They're still going to keep half of what they conquered, or the Nazis who did all this stuff and wrecked your country, well, their soldiers will leave, but they're going to stay in power. In addition to all the other caveats we talked about how they don't want to stop the war, how can you justify it if you're the Allies sort of morally to not do that? And the other thing I came across, now this is a bit more of, I think, fantastical historical thinking of the kind you see sometimes by people who mostly experience history or feel they experience history through computer games, which is where anything is possible, any alternate outcome is possible. It's not that easy in real life to just do whatever. There's a critique I read that, the Western Allies should not have pursued unconditional surrender because that caused the Germans to resist for longer, which allowed the Soviets to conquer more of Eastern Europe and impose their communist dictatorships and all the terrible stuff that went along with that. And that, we could have prevented, the communist horrors for, Poland or Romania or what have you, if only we'd made a compromise peace with Nazi Germany. That I have a problem with. That to me makes no sense whatsoever for two reasons. One is, it's not like being ruled by the Nazis was nice. They killed more people than the Soviets in the areas that they controlled during the short time that they controlled them, and it's not even close. I know there's other discussions about numbers. I don't want to get into that. If we're talking 4 years, there's no comparison, right? So it's not like if the Nazis had stayed in power because of a compromise peace, things would have been great for people who ended up suffering under communists. Not at all. The other, I think, what could the Western Allies have done? They're not going to just magically stop the Red Army from marching where it wants to march in the last 2 years of the war. So I don't think that's a very reasonable way of looking at it personally.
I mean, when you look at the realities on the ground, of course, well, in some parts of Germany, the Allies, particularly Americans, advanced further east than they were supposed to. So a lot of Saxony and, Sachsen-Anhalt, the area around Magdeburg and Leipzig as well, they were occupied first by the Americans, and this was then handed over to the Soviets afterwards. So there's this counter argument: could they have got to Berlin before the Soviets if they really pushed for it? Possibly, but why? Because at that stage you'd already agreed on occupation zones, so it doesn't make sense. When you go further into Eastern Europe, as you say, looking at it realistically, there's not much they could have done, even though I personally still think the Western Allies have a lot to answer for. Because they, in many ways, you might say, when you look at the conferences and the relationships they had, and also Potsdam, what goes on there, I find it always quite bizarre, these countries being used as bargaining chips. So you get this country and we get Greece for this, and you get that and you get this.
The back of the and napkin also, percentages and all of that.
Exactly, and moving the matches kind of from the right to the left. So this is how we're going to shift the borders and all this. I mean, there is a lot because the Allies knew this, and so when you look at sometimes I would say the naivety you find on the American part to a degree, and of course Churchill probably being wiser and cleverer, but he knew that Britain was a junior partner, so there was nothing they could do. The Brits actually, he orders the British senior generalship to have a look at a potential war against the Soviet Union at that particular stage, and they very quickly come to the conclusion there's nothing we can do in a conventional war against the Soviet Union. They're simply too strong. I mean, if you go all the way back to the beginning of the Second World War, this is where it all goes wrong, you might say, and we've talked about this previously. So why does Britain and France declare war on Germany in 1939, but not the Soviet Union? But this then comes back again, springing forward, you say, well, the war aims also changed, don't they? Because you talked about how can you justify this? You also have to justify it to your own people. And if you say we've had this war for 4, 5, 6 years, and lots of people have died, you need to have a proper outcome, which is quite often, when you look at how wars end, one of the major issues that you find, because people demand something powerful, something decisive as an outcome. It was, you might say, much, much easier in the old days, so the days before nationalism arose. So let's say pre-1789, for example, because the war was considered as the king's affair. And the king loses a battle, he wins a battle, it doesn't really matter. So they could make whatever peace they wanted. If a few people die, okay, that's just the way it is. You might find yourself fighting in one army the one day, the other army the next day. This is all changed. And if you're fighting a war for, if it's national survival or along some sort of national boundaries and aims, you need to give something to the population. That means war aims change. So that's also why you have unconditional surrender coming in 1943 and not earlier or perhaps even later.
Indeed. Well, I think we're probably ready to bring our discussion of unconditional surrender to an end for today. Mistake or not, let us know what you think in the comments. My view is probably not. If you liked our discussion today, and if you like what you hear generally, if you've listened to other episodes of the podcast, of course, we'd be very happy if you decide to support us and make all of this possible for us and our production partners at Battle Guide. To do that, you can go to our website, bothsidesofthewire.com, and you can become a member of our community there. You can become a supporter of the podcast there. You can also get access to exclusive content there in the War Room. You can even get a free trial period to listen to exclusive content. You can do that by entering the promotional code Deep Dark Woods. So we hope to see you there in the War Room. We hope to take your questions about unconditional surrender and other topics. But that's it for today, folks, and we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. But I think, I had it in my brain.
And now it's
and
gone.
it went away. No, come back, Goebbels. Yeah.
Has it totally surrendered, you thought?
Yeah.
You thought it's gone.